You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 25th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 2 a.m. in Tokyo, 2000 in Beirut, 1800 here in London and 1300 in New York City. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Can Israel or Hezbollah be talked out of whatever is about to happen? Increasing birth rate, economic necessity or reactionary fetish? And before Spain extends greater rights to apes, should it maybe think about bulls? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Latika Burke and James Rogers will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Samir Puri about his new book, Westlessness, outlining the multifarious ways in which the world's balances of power are tilting. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Latika Burke, writer-at-large for The Nightly, and by James Rogers, Associate Professor of International Journalism at City University of London. Hello to you both.
Hi, Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Latika, sadly, we cannot do justice in this audio medium to your outfit. You are dressed up as appropriate to somebody who is shortly going to be dining with somebody who once did the most important job in our country.
The Australian cricket captain.
Indeed.
Well, former Ricky Ponting, yes. Of all the dignitaries we meet, Andrew, I suspect you have most FOMO about my dinner tonight.
I really do. I mean, I wasn't busy. You could have invited me.
Next time, I promise. He's turned into a winemaker, which is actually why I'll be heading to dinner with him at a very nice Aussie restaurant. And his wines are actually very, very good. I was sceptical. I'm a bit of a skeptic about these celebs come lately turning their face and mugs and putting them on Prosecco bottles and the like. But Ricky Ponting's wine is Australian, and that automatically sets it at a pretty high bar.
It does.
But his is very, very good.
Does he do a Pinot Noir? He has a natural advantage as a Tasmanian there.
Yeah, he does. But the wine, I think, is made in mostly South Australia. But I'm not a huge fan of South Australian reds, but his are absolutely great.
James, we failed to meet recently in Washington, D.C. when we were both there at the same time. But you were there working on what is going to be another new book or an updated version of one already available?
Another new book about
Good Lord.
Russia's relations with the West since the end of the Cold War. And I was consulting archives at the National Archives in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C.
I mean, that's quite a big subject. How are you keeping that down to non-forklift necessary length?
With a degree of difficulty, I have to say, Andrew. My sort of previous incarnation as a radio journalist has helped me when you had to tell a story in 30 or 40 seconds for a news summary. But yes, it is a big subject. I mean, I think I found a way through it, and I think I found a sort of core argument. I mean, obviously, the archives are limited because a lot of it is still sensitive, and because of the political situation, it's out of the question for me to go to Russia, a country where I lived and worked for many years, hence my interest in the book. But I found some good resources in the United States, I think, and coupled with archives here and interviews with people involved in policy making, I hope I'm going to have something readers will be interested in come this time next year.
Well, we will be coming back to Russia later in the show, but we will start in the Middle East, which appears, as it so very often does, on the brink. At least 51 more people have been reported killed by Israeli airstrikes on what Israel says are Hezbollah targets in Lebanon today, after nearly 500 died yesterday. Hezbollah has launched various projectiles at Israel, including a ballistic missile brought down near Tel Aviv by Israeli air defences. The UN Security Council is holding an emergency meeting today to discuss events. US President Joe Biden has used his speech to the UN General Assembly to plead for restraint, but various governments, the UK's included, are urging citizens to leave Lebanon, and tens of thousands of Lebanese are leaving to elsewhere in the country, small as it is. James, first of all, breaking in the last hour or so, General Herzi Halevi, the chief of the Israeli Defense Forces, has told his troops to be prepared to deploy into Lebanon. Do you get the sense that the momentum towards something big is becoming irreversible?
Yes, I do, actually. I'm sorry to say. You've mentioned the number of civilians who are on the move In Lebanon, there's some 60,000 Israelis, of course, as well, who've been away from their homes in northern Israel for coming up to a year. So I do sense that. I mean, I think last week, these curious attacks on exploding pages that Israel, of course, has denied any involvement with, but nobody plausibly thinks that anybody else was behind them, did seem to be the precursor to something even more substantial than the airstrikes that we've seen in the last few days. And if the Army Chief of Staff is saying this, I think there's no reason not to think that he's true. What he's saying is true.
Latika, what do you think? Is there any chance at all that Israel is trying to bluff Hezbollah into climbing down?
I mean, Hezbollah, and James will certainly know more than me on this, is in a very weak position. I mean, Lebanon has not been governed properly for many years now. And what is really interesting is if you read local accounts, the support for Hezbollah is waning in a way that it wasn't during previous conflicts. So that in itself, I think, is fascinating to see why Israel is choosing now to pounce. I mean, let's not forget Hezbollah fired rockets on October 7 or 8. That was seen as the trigger against Israel and justifying Israel's retaliatory strike. So why now to come to this escalatory point? Maybe it's a confidence that they are settling things in Gaza and they're opening up another front. Obviously, they do want to get that northern border secure. But look, I think while there is always some hope, while there's no escalation, that diplomacy will work. Diplomacy so far is not working in restraining Israel, is it? Because every time the Biden administration asks them to agree to a ceasefire, please slow down, please restrain yourselves, we only see escalation.
James, how ride or die on this do we think Hezbollah are, though? It is a long time, I'll acknowledge, since I did any actual reporting on Hezbollah in Lebanon, but I did meet quite a lot of their senior officials, including Deputy Secretary General Naim Qassem, and it struck me that one of the differences between them and Hamas was that I found Hezbollah rigorously rational in their own way, very organised, very methodical, very thoughtful. None of this is an endorsement of anything for which they stand, to be clear, but they didn't strike me as having that slightly crazed apocalyptic edge that you often detect in both Hamas's rhetoric and among Hamas's foot soldiers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will come a point where there's some sort of diplomacy involved, but I don't think we're there yet, and I think that this is going to escalate further. I mean, if you think about the situation they're in, it was interesting to note yesterday an article I was reading in the Financial Times pointing out that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's poll ratings have gone up since the attacks on Hezbollah. The cynic would say distracting from the campaign in Gaza, which is nearly 12 months old and has not really delivered either of its stated objectives, which was to free all of the hostages or to destroy Hamas militarily. So this is something that has gained in popularity and something which is much less controversial within Israeli society than the conduct of the war in Gaza. But I also think if we look at Hezbollah, after the big blow that they've had from the taking out of senior figures and so on, both they and Israel have to have something at the end of this that they can show that they've made some sort of progress militarily, be it striking back against the attacks that Israel made on their senior leadership. And Israel needs to show that if they can't get the people back towards their homes in the northern area of Israel, then they need to show they're on the way towards that. I fear, therefore, that this is going to go some way before there is a cessation of hostilities.
Just to follow that up, James, you talk about an attack on Hezbollah being relatively popular with the Israeli public, which is perfectly understandable. We should remember that 60,000 Israelis or thereabouts haven't been able to go home for months, who live in the north of Israel because of Hezbollah's rocketing. Do you anticipate, though, a reasonably muted response to the idea of Hezbollah being put out of business by other Arab governments, though, who've mostly been notably very quiet about the possible demise of Hamas, and quite a lot of whom, possibly Syria accepted, would have no great love for Hezbollah either?
Well, that's true, but I also think that, given the tensions in the region, I think probably everybody there is hoping that this isn't going to go any further. I mean, because there's lots of reasons why it should. I mean, the interesting situation, and I remember reading a book about the causes of the First World War about 10 years ago, Christopher Clark's excellent The Sleepwalkers, and, the one big lesson you take away from that book was that the conditions were there for a war. Nobody actually wanted it, but the conditions were there, and therefore eventually it happened. And I think we're in a similar situation in the region at the moment, unfortunately.
And I think it's worth, Andrew, just reflecting on 12 months later, which we're nearly approaching now after the attacks. World leaders were very optimistic at that time that it was now or never, that we would see some sort of resolution to the Middle East. Actually, the opposite appears to be happening before our eyes. This could very well escalate into something that is far more widespread and regional than we thought 12 months ago.
Just a final thought on this, Latika. I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying earlier about diplomacy not working. All of this is, of course, occurring against the backdrop of the UN General Assembly meeting. We have heard from Secretary-General Antonio Guterres muttering about parties to war now thinking they had a get-out-of-jail-free card and that there was no accountability and that everybody just thought they could do as they pleased. In making that speech, though, he is kind of acknowledging the impotence of the organisation he leads, isn't he?
I think there is no more despairing backdrop than the UN this week, showing exactly that, Andrew, its impotence. The UN Security Council will again be blocked and vetoed by usual suspects over the usual issues, and nobody thinks that UNGA is going to solve one of these problems. I mean, we had an extraordinary situation in Australia last week where the Prime Minister was briefing out, or the Prime Minister's office was briefing out, that he was going to Delaware for the Quad Summit to meet with Biden, Kishida and Modi, but he could not be bothered going to New York for UNGA because it was a waste of time. And to be honest, I don't think he's that wrong.
Well, let's move along to possibly related news, which is that Iran has picked this, of all moments, to start acting reasonable. Iran's new Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said Iran is ready to discuss the presently moribund deal struck by Iran and other concerned parties in 2015 over Iran's nuclear program. This imploded in 2018 when then US President Donald Trump flounced out of it. Araghchi's declaration is being apprised in some optimistic quarters as a change of tack from new Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, who is widely hailed a moderate. Brief reminder that in the Iranian context, this still means that he believes that women who tie their scarves too loosely should be beaten up in public by paid agents of the state. James, a theory doing the rounds about Iran suddenly wishing to be reasonable on this is that Iran fears that if Israel does knock Hezbollah over, it will then have a freer hand to act directly against Iran's nuclear facilities. And is Iran trying to tie something down before Israel has a whack at them?
Yeah, very possibly. And I think, we do have to see this in the larger context of what's going on. But I think it's also useful to remember that, this is an area in which there has previously and, until quite recently been significant cooperation between Russia and the West, even when things were going badly. Russia was a big party to that agreement. So it's one of those interesting moments in international relations when you get, severe enmity. You get people who have got, as Latika was pointing out, people have got stakes in the wider conflict in the region at the moment and are backing various different sides and yet are willing to cooperate on this issue. So I think there is some sort of grounds for optimism. But, again, remember that at the same time as the United States and other Western allies are sending vast quantities of weapons to assist Ukraine, Iran, although it denies it, is believed to be helping Russia by supplying missiles and drones. The Iranians have said that's based on faulty intelligence. There's no reason why they wouldn't be, though, because obviously they are very closely working with Russia. So, again, I think that we can take this as a sign that, there are areas in which there can be kinds of cooperation. I note, too, that the Foreign Minister is even saying that he might stay in New York for a few days after the UN General Assembly concludes in order to get involved with some talks. We'll see, but let's try and take some optimism where we can. But I think, the interpretation you originally offered, Andrew, does also, hold some water too.
Latika, another pet theory which I will introduce here, which is that Iran doesn't and never has really wanted to build a bomb because they realise that actually doing that would invite an unbelievable world of hassle upon them, but what they want is to be talked out of it. They want something in return for not doing the thing they don't actually really want to do.
Yes, and just on my earlier point too, it is worth reflecting that just a couple of weeks ago, the daily briefings from John Kirby, the National Security Communications White House spokesman, we're calling on Iran not to attack. We were only a couple of weeks ago talking about Iran attacking Israel. That has not materialised. And I think, yes, that does underline your pet theory there. I am not as optimistic as James. I'll believe this when I see it, because at the moment, Iran is in a very enviable position of getting a lot without doing much. Through arming the Houthis, through arming Hezbollah, that rocket they fired today was Iranian-made. As James points out, they are equipping Russia with drones, and I have been to Defence Intelligence Agency briefings setting out the intelligence on that very clearly. It's very comprehensive, and it's pretty much 100% true. So Iran is actually getting a lot for, exactly as you say, just threatening and talking and being walked back from those threats.
Do you think, though, if we would link this story back to the one we started with, James, that Iran does actually want a war between Hezbollah and Israel? I mean, it is a murky question, the degree to which Hezbollah acts on Iran's instructions. Certainly, Hezbollah themselves are extremely sensitive to any such suggestions that they merely respond to orders from Tehran. But then I have also spoken to Israeli officials who, of course, may well have a cart to push on this, who insist that the chain of command is extremely short.
Well, I think, I don't think it's in any of the parties' interest in the region for a wider conflict. I think they want to achieve, short-term gains, strategic gains from some points of view, but obviously it's not going to settle the question entirely of Israel's northern border. It's not going to settle the question of the relations between Israel and Iran in the region either. But I don't think anybody is really saying, OK, let's go for it now, let's have a major war. So I think, I do think it's plausible Iran wants... I think in Hezbollah they have an ally with whom they can irritate and annoy Israel, that they can use to turn up and down the pressure. But I don't think, anybody in that region really wants a major all-out war for what the consequences would be. I think that all the parties are very aware of what they could be, and they're all aware of what's at risk there.
Just finally on this one, Latika, is there actually any point in anybody getting into this now anyway? The United States will elect a new president or a previous president about 6 weeks from now.
Yeah, and I think that is important, particularly into Netanyahu's thinking, because we've obviously seen that relationship between Biden and Netanyahu deteriorate and deteriorate and deteriorate. Interestingly, Donald Trump was very critical of Netanyahu probably about 3 or 4 months ago, and has now started saying much more favourable things. He had a dinner with Netanyahu a couple of months ago at Mar-a-Lago, I think it was, when Netanyahu was in DC. So, yes, I agree with you. I think a lot of this is about preparing the ground, one, making hay while Biden is in his lame duck months, and then preparing the ground for what comes next.
Well, to Russia now, where officialdom is fretting about a dwindling supply of Russians. Notwithstanding the human costs of the imperial misadventures of a president who seems to believe himself some child of Peter and Catherine the Great, Russia's birth rate is dipping to the extent that 144 million Russians today may be a mere 120 million by 2050. Accordingly, patriotic and financial encouragement is being made to Russian women to have more children. Any alleged promotion of childlessness is being clamped down upon, and Russia's health minister Yevgeny Shestopolov suggested that busy Russians could commit the act of procreation during breaks at work, even if it puts colleagues off their sandwiches. James, what is actually going on here? Is there a major economic problem here, or is this just further example of nationalist dementia? We must, in the same way that Russia thinks it must have more space, despite being the biggest country on earth, there are
increasingly sparsely populated.
But there are those of us from relatively small countries, such as Australia, for example, who would think that 120 million's plenty to go round.
Well, it is. This is actually a perennial problem in Russia, and I was interested when I was reading these reports today. I was just wondering, because there was a big dip in the birth rate in the early 1990s after the end of the Soviet Union, massive period of economic uncertainty, and I wonder if that means there's a smaller demographic and therefore people come into their 30s who might, normally be starting to have children. But it is a big problem, and it's come round before. The government has tried this before in much better economic times. In the late 2008, 2009, there was a big campaign to try to persuade people to have more children. But it has been very typical since the end of the Soviet period, certainly in urban areas of Russia, it's very normal for couples only to have one child, and so this is why things, things keep going down and down and down. And at the moment, because a lot of men of working age are in the army. There's a desperate labour shortage, of course, because all the armaments factories are working overtime as well. and in Russia, because of the nationalist tone of the government, as you know, in many other countries, some form of immigration will be proposed as a way of addressing the labour shortage. That is politically unacceptable among large parts of the Russian electorate, such as, obviously, electorate's maybe not quite the right word there, but it's also something that's encouraged by the authorities, that we are Russia, we don't need any outside help, so it's a big, big problem.
It is a thing, Latika. I mean, whether or not it's a problem is debatable, but it's a thing now in most developed countries. Something like 3/4 of the world's countries by 2050 will be below replacement level. Again, it's the same question, though. Is this necessarily a problem?
Well, yes, I think in terms of economic productivity, if you want to look at raw numbers like that, it is a problem for those sorts of people. I actually don't see this as a uniquely Russian problem. I see the response as uniquely Russian, but I don't think that this is something immune to, that the rest of the world is immune to. I mean, look at China. I mean, their birth rate is declining for the first time in history. Their population has shrunk to below that of India's for the first time in history. It is the case that as women become more educated, have more options and can see and access opportunities, they, hey presto, want fewer children. This is not and should not be a surprise to anybody, regardless of what country we're coming from, particularly those with access to some degree of media literacy. And I would put Russia in that category. China is exactly the same. They talk about the brat generation. Children do not want to be having many children. They want to be having good lives with opportunities. So I actually don't see this as a Russian issue.
This is what I was wondering about, though. You say it's not necessarily anything new, and I guess it's not if we start thinking back to the post-World War II period, but is it a thing that we are as a species still adjusting to the grand scheme of things, actually extremely recent idea that women do have other options?
I mean, I've always been quite sceptical about how politicians manage this conversation out loud, because if you look at, for example, how many Russian women are responding to this campaign and this rhetoric from Putin, they don't like it. I mean, it's one thing to be brainwashed about going to war with Ukraine, but don't come after my body and don't tell me how many children I'm going to have when I can look around and kind of it's the one thing I think I can make a decision on for myself. So I've always been very uncomfortable with politicians getting out there and yelling about the birth rate. I think there's no worse advocate for this probably than Elon Musk, who seems to have taken it upon himself to tell women of the world to go forth and have babies and procreate.
He's a very strange little man, however.
Elon Musk has many odd obsessions. This is probably the oddest.
Oh, I don't know.
Big call?
It's a big call. There is a long list of contenders. But bringing this back to Russia, James, do you think that these appeals to patriotism are going to work? Are we going to end up with, medals struck for women who've had 9 children, declaring them heroes of the revolution or whatever the threshold previously was?
We are, but I suspect there won't be very many of them. But I think they will have a very high public profile. They will probably be invited to the Kremlin, presented with said medals struck specially in their honour and paraded on national television. But I think the point that Latika makes about educated professional women wanting control of their own bodies are as pertinent in Russia as they are in any other sort of educated society in the world. And I think this, and we have to combine this with there is, I think such as political opposition is in Russia, there was maybe a big degree of questions about the war in Ukraine when it first started. However, I think a lot of people in Russia probably think, well, we're in it now and we have to stick with it. But I think this is a very separate issue. And remember that, if you consider the governments that Russians have had, this very educated, cultured nation has not been blessed with good governments throughout its history. So they don't really necessarily respect or trust them. And I think this will be something about which people will either ignore or will talk very quietly in private and quietly ignore. But there will, I suspect, be those hero mothers on TV in the Kremlin with the medals around their neck.
Well, to Spain, and exciting news for the larger primates resident therein. A consultation is ongoing about a possible new law which would offer greater protection to our relatives in recognition of their greater cognitive abilities, at least relative to other zoo inmates such as aardvarks and rhinoceroses, which are just idiots. A variation on this idea has been circulating in Spanish politics since at least 2008, when a parliamentary committee resolved that non-human hominids such as gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos and orangutans were entitled to the rights to life and freedom. They'll be wanting the vote next. Latika, fundamentally, actually, given some of the choices that democracies have made in recent years, I'm not sure they're not entitled to it, but fundamentally, where are we on this?
I'm maybe the wrong person to ask on this, because I'm probably of the Karl Lagerfeld, would leave my entire fortune to my cat if I could.
I think technically you can.
No,
I
he
don't
did.
know if anyone's stopping you.
He did. He left it all to Chapette. I'm not joking. So I might leave my miserly income to Chloe. But anyway, I digress. Look, I actually think this is probably where the world, in terms of Western world, is heading. I think in a couple more decades, we will be absolutely... we'll find it abhorrent that we factory farmed. I think we will find it abhorrent that we had zoos. And I do think there is some sort of right or welfare standard that will be bestowed to animals worldwide. And I think one of the things that will unlock that will be if we crack lab-grown meat. I think that will be very critical to this. But I actually do think this is a debate that is heading in one direction.
See, I tend to agree with pretty much all of that, James. The thing I enjoy thinking about from time to time, and you start to notice these things when you've lived long enough, and you can remember a time when behaviour X, which seemed perfectly normal in your lifetime, now just seems abhorrent, incomprehensible and barbarous. Yeah. And even speaking as a meat eater, I think we are going to get there with a lot of the things that Latika mentioned, especially when artificial or lab-grown meat becomes indistinguishable and as inexpensive as the real thing. I think at that point the game probably is up. But are we at least a little bit amused, James, and I'm going to direct all the hate mail to you, that it is Spain taking a lead on this? This is a country, and I quote my late great friend PJ O'Rourke, that built an entire culture on teasing farm animals.
Yeah, I know it is interesting. But I mean, I think, from a serious point of view, I think I would agree with pretty much everything that Latika said, and I agree with the points about meat eating. It's interesting. I was a vegetarian for some years, a long time ago when I was a student, and I read a lot of the literature then about the inefficiency of producing animals for meat because of the amount of feed that they need to consume. 40-odd years later, those arguments seem finally to be landing in a much wider public debate. They were very much sort of vegetarian fringe. The vegetarians who, seek to advance their cause will put these arguments forward. And now that, there's a lot of consideration about this, about the amount of pollution that, set aside the cruelty issue, which is very real too, but about the amount of pollution that intensive farming produces. So, yes, I think we probably are going that way. I mean, obviously... if we're talking about being of a certain age, Andrew, you may remember a satirical television programme in the 1980s in which there was a gorilla who'd been captured on a talk show. The person who captured him, the person who captured him said, he was completely wild when I caught him, and Gerald, the gorilla, says, "Wild, I was absolutely livid." But I do, I think, as science advances, we will understand the sentient nature of these beings, and will probably be outrage future generations, probably not very far in the future, that they were used in laboratory experiments. I mean,
only 100 years ago we were poaching, and that was a normal thing to do. Bring home huge tigers and lions and stuff them and put you in for decor. I mean, now if you went to a stately home in Britain somewhere where that was found in a loft or an attic or something, you'd be absolutely... you'd find that deplorable.
Yeah. The argument that is underpinning this, Latika, is that apes, the non-human hominids, can experience human-adjacent emotions, and that is doubtless the case. And to that, a bit of a plug for a previous Monocle Radio programme here. We owe a lot of our understanding of that to Jane Goodall, who I did once interview for our programme, The Big Interview. It is on our website. And this was her great revelation, which weirdly doesn't seem like it should have been a revelation, but at the time that it was, that these animals do have moods and they have feelings, that they have distinct personalities. But where do we end up stopping with that? Because any dog or indeed cat owner would be well aware that that was the case.
And I think this is the balance that this debate will have to find, because really it will come down to a welfare issue. So I think this is going to be problematic for things like zoos, marine parks. We already have some very successful campaigns against things like keeping dolphins and whales in marine parks, for example. I think that debate is one to be had for as long as it pertains to things like zoos, animal testing, and then I think we will probably get to the farming issue and consumption issue. But I think step by step that process needs to be had, because you don't want to get to a position where we've just outright given, the mouse human rights. That would be a little bit over the top.
Not the one that lives under my kitchen tiles. Latika Burke and James Rogers, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, learned and worthy fretting about the decline of the West has been a favourite theme of hand-wringing Poindexters almost as long as there has been a West. Westlessness, a new book by Samir Puri, is emphatically not that. Subtitled The Great Global Rebalancing, it is instead an argument that while the West is not necessarily in retreat, other actors are very much on the advance. I spoke to Samir earlier and began by asking him to define the term he deploys as his book's title.
Less is the key syllable. So I'm not saying collapse of the West. I'm not saying end of the West. What I'm saying is that this coming era, especially for Westerners, is one where we have to become accustomed to playing a less central role in different aspects of world affairs. So it's that adjustment, that sense of relative change from an artificially high, perhaps, of a couple of centuries of extraordinary influence across different incarnations of the West, to a world in which there are other countries, and not just China, not just India, but perhaps other countries working in unison, that are better able to argue their case, that have got more wealth, and that eventually may even surpass different Western countries as the benchmarks for modernity, which is that place that we in the West became, I think, very comfortable occupying. So it's a book about adjustment for a coming era.
I mean, you do make the point quite early on that people have been predicting the decline and collapse of the West at least since Oswald Spengler more than a century ago. And it's important to note that this is not that. But is it necessarily, from the West's point of view, a bad thing? Is there a way that Westlessness could work to the West's benefit? Because this doesn't have to be a zero-sum proposition, does it?
Oh, if only more people spoke like you are right now, because sometimes I fear, because it's still quite a novel thing where this long-expected, long-awaited rebalancing, which people have been writing about for years, is now actually much more upon us. Pardon me, the pop culture reference is a bit like those knights in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, who you see they're running, about 5 miles away, and then all of a sudden, without any intervening shots, they're right next to you. That's a little bit what the rise of China feels like, especially since I'm joining you here from Asia. We know it's been coming for decades, but now it's becoming much more palpable. And I think I don't need to go through the headline stories. Everyone will be familiar with those. Could it be a good thing? Well, I certainly hope so, because the West can't circle the wagons and guard its privileged positions with no give and take, for the very simple reason that responsible statecraft, responsible management of the world, whether you're talking about geopolitics or the energy transition or a host of other specific policy areas and things, are going to have to accommodate different voices, different actors. And not because I think the notion of equality is good in its own sake, but just because other parts of the world are not going to accept the West's lead in everything, are certainly not going to accept it without their own voices being heard. And give you, two really quick examples on this. One is the energy transition, which I focus on at the end of my book. It's one thing for UK to host COP26, as we did a few years ago, and to sort of ask for the end of coal usage. But India, China, they're coming from such a different perspective. They'll think, how convenient that the fuel you use to power the European Industrial Revolution 150 years ago is all of a sudden morally inadmissible now that we're having our catch-ups. So it's not about right or wrong, but the dialogue has got to accommodate the fact that those critical advances in local economies have happened at different parts of the world at different times. And one other example, if I may, totally different area of policy and of global concern. We have seen how the war in Gaza has bifurcated opinions. There's no issue like it that can bifurcate opinions so sharply. But isn't it interesting that it's South Africa that brought the case against Israel's military conduct to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and a host of other countries, some in the global south, but including others like Ireland, have actually implicitly or explicitly endorsed it, called for a two-state solution. So you have a global south country, South Africa, leading or influencing through a leadership position the global debate around this particular issue. I, for one, don't remember that sort of thing happening 30 years ago when I was sort of coming out of high school, going to university. And certainly I think across the last century, we just haven't seen countries like South Africa, India and others be able to be in a position to call upon other forces in the world and lead debates and discussions. A lot of this, the last comment on this, is an outcome of the rise of China, but that's why I like not to think of the rise of China as this singular challenge to the West. Arguably, it is. China-US is a big singular bilateral rivalry. I'm not taking away its importance, but China's rise has been a door opener for a whole host of other developments. It's forced every country around the world to think about what a world less singularly dominated by the USA, by the West, by the Europeans that the US sort of follows on the coattails of would look like. And, South Africa is part of the BRICS club. Brazil, Russia, India, China, they are the S in BRICS. And it's not only about the BRICS club, but the BRICS club expanded this year to induct 5 new members. And there's a lot of talk that it might expand again this October when the next BRICS summit takes place in Russia. Malaysia and Thailand, I believe, are quite keen to join. So now you start to see these trends we've maybe discussed for decades about a catch-up, a rebalancing, start to become a bit more tangible in day-to-day sort of newspaper headlines and world events.
Well, as a final thought then, nobody generally enjoys ceding any amount of power and status, and relatively speaking, that's what you're arguing the West is going to have to get used to doing. There will obviously be attempts to reverse or halt the whole standing athwart the tides of history, screaming stop, etc. We're seeing an amount of that with what's known as decoupling, people trying to reduce their dependence on China. Is there any point to any of that? Is that basically, and I'm mixing metaphors here hideously, is that basically flailing at the tide with a broom?
I love that latter metaphor. I've never heard it before, but that point about distinguishing areas where Westlessness strikes versus areas where the West's influence still holds really strong, that's a big part of my book. I'm not trying to present a straw man argument and say, the West is doomed. For example, in popular culture, the highest grossing films globally, they're still from the US. Lingua franca is still the European origin languages, chiefly English, but not exclusively. So and the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. So there's plenty of bastions of strength that the West has. But the fun thing with this book is, as well as the hard power questions of economics, military force, resolving wars, the things we've discussed, I also go into issues of identity and popular culture, because a big part of the West's influence has been the westernization of people's imaginations, aspirations. Go to Australia, go to the UK, go to New York for your education, for example, if you're Singaporean or Indian. That's a big thing for elite families with aspirations to maybe do well in business or tech or everything else like that. Watch American films, juxtapose those with the Bollywood films, or BTS, listen to that while listening to Taylor Swift. Those sorts of mix and match of some Western ingredients and some local or non-Western, non-English language components to someone's education and sort of entertainment diet. My contention is that the balance as it's held for the last few decades won't hold indefinitely. Western global exports of higher education and pop culture will still have massive unique appeal, but they'll probably start to be matched by alternatives from other parts of the world as well. And there's a strong possibility where you see the Western components dilute as the world ends up with a lot more sort of aspirational modernities that are totally non-Western. South Korean being one right now, but I don't think we can just stop right there and think, the world that we've all grown up becoming accustomed to will just kind of stop at the balance we've got now. I think it's going to keep tilting. And a lot of what the West is going to have to do is understand where its equities remain, encourage others to sort of join the tent, but also to hold firm where it still feels it has something to offer the world, which is across many, many different spheres. But I think no matter what you think of what I present in the book, I think we can all agree that the world in 25 years from now is just not going to be the world as it is today or as it was 25 years in the past.
That was Samir Puri. Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing is out now and very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Latika Burke and James Rogers. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Jamani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.